Technology has ushered in remarkable and even unprecedented shifts in our methods of communication, employment, and lifestyle. The arrival of mobile phones, social media platforms, and remote work functionalities have dismantled the geographical barriers that once limited our interactions and opportunities, enabling individuals to remain engaged and effective from almost any location worldwide. We now enjoy instant access to vast amounts of information, the capability to collaborate with colleagues across various continents, and the chance to share personal experiences. This level of connectivity has transformed our social engagements and workplace dynamics, facilitating adaptable schedules and fostering a focus on outcomes rather than hours worked. While the women are present, Paul engages in conversation with Mark, who appears despondent despite having just received an award. It seems he feels a bit irked that Paul did not offer him the opportunity to speak on stage earlier. He believes that Paul consistently takes the credit for himself, disregarding the collaborative effort. Upon hearing this, Paul expressed his regrets and acknowledged Mark as a true friend. Meanwhile, in the restroom, Vanessa disclosed a significant detail about her enduring relationship with Mark to Julia. She shared that she and Mark had begun swapping partners with other couples 6 months prior. Vanessa noted that this development did not create any rift between them, rather, it strengthened their bond. Julia attempted to mask her surprise upon learning this revelation, but as she drove home, she struggled to focus on the road, preoccupied with thoughts of Vanessa's secret. Conversely, after returning from the event, Mark confessed that he was aware of Vanessa's sentiments, revealed their secret about the relationship to Julia, as her demeanor appeared unusual. He mentioned they were preparing for sleep, yet Mark unexpectedly proposed to Vanessa. Vanessa laughed, assuming Mark was intoxicated. Julia could no longer tolerate keeping Vanessa's secret, so, in the middle of the night, she roused Paul, who was peacefully sleeping. Julia promptly informed him about her earlier conversation with Vanessa in the bathroom. However, Paul showed little interest, considering Julia's words to be nonsensical, presuming she was still tipsy. If he mentioned it to Mark the next day, he would probably just laugh it off. So, Paul urged Julia to return to sleep. The following morning, Julia had breakfast with her daughter, Ma, and Paul. She was still preoccupied with thoughts of Vanessa and felt particularly frustrated with Paul for dismissing her concerns. Paul stood firm in his belief that partner swapping was unwise. He thought Julia was merely envious of Vanessa and Mark, but that didn't mean they had to emulate their actions. Paul believed the relationship was stable, but Julia was equally adamant that spontaneity was essential, as the relationship had settled into a predictable routine. Paul declined to engage with Julia's points and prepared for work instead. Afterward, Julia and Paul went on with their separate tasks. Julia checked the weather report on a television channel, while Paul occupied himself in the operating room. Despite claiming indifference during the procedure, he noticed Mark's actions and eventually inquired about Julia and Vanessa's conversation during their gym sessions. Mark acknowledged it was accurate but mentioned that he and Vanessa communicate openly, leaving nothing concealed. They both appreciated the positive effects of this shift in their relationship. Mark later inquired about how Paul and Julia preserve their passion for one another, but Paul sidestepped the question. He then took Emma to her friend's residence, where he attempted to caution her about being mindful when interacting with boys, especially since Julia indicated that Emma was developing feelings. Emma felt uneasy discussing that with her father and opted to disregard his counsel. Meanwhile, Vanessa and Julia went out shopping together. During this time, Vanessa suggested that Julia and Paul should explore what they were doing. She believed that sharing partners could be another method to enhance affection for one's partner. As a result of this dialogue, Julia, who is usually reserved, reflected on Vanessa's advice. Upon returning from their shopping trip, she approached Paul to suggest spending the night together, but Paul was preoccupied and could not be interrupted. The following morning, Julia persisted in expressing her interest in trying what Vanessa and Mark had done. She was unable to stop contemplating how the experience was actually executed. Julia urged her husband to reach out to Mark, but Paul maintained that Julia was overreacting, asking her to refrain from pressuring him. Furthermore, Paul believed their marriage was perfectly fine. There was nothing needing resolution. Ultimately, Julia opened up to Paul, expressing that she felt their marriage had lost its excitement. She also sensed that Paul was no longer interested in her, so she wished for Paul to have a conversation with Mark about the partner swap event. Feeling ignored, Julia grew despondent, which in turn made Paul increasingly uneasy. Upon returning to work, Paul requested that Mark be candid about how the event functioned. Yet, Mark believed Paul was not someone who would appreciate such an endeavor. He almost pointed out that this wasn't the proper approach to mending a marriage. Nevertheless, Paul was already stressed by Julia's expectations, so Mark eventually detailed how the situation would unfold. Paul was aware he would be intimate with Vanessa while Mark would be with Julia, but both couples were required to be in the same room. Mark further proposed they rehearse beforehand, like a stage play, and insisted they remain fully clothed. Upon hearing this, Paul found it absurd, but Mark inquired whether he had any interest in Vanessa. Paul replied negatively, insisting he had no emotional attachment to her. Finally, Mark invited Paul to accompany Julia to his friend Daniel's birthday celebration on Friday evening, suggesting it would help them unwind. Paul hesitated at first because he and Julia had a dinner date that evening. Additionally, he was uncertain about his enjoyment of the party, yet he ultimately consented after Mark reassured him that he could decline any unacceptable invites. To sum it up, the evening arrived. Before heading downstairs, Paul and Julia decided on a secret signal that indicated it was time to leave. Paul felt skeptical and anxious, while Julia was filled with anticipation for their shared experience. Shortly after, they made their way downstairs where Daniel welcomed them at the door as the guests congregated around the pool. Daniel encouraged them to explore, introducing them to several friends. Without delay, he suggested that Julia engage in a conversation with him, leaving Paul to interact with the woman present, one of whom was Nan. Paul appeared quite uncomfortable, even while Nan expressed interest in him. He was intent on watching Julia, who was deep in conversation with Daniel, seemingly ignoring Paul. Soon after, Vanessa approached and invited Julia to talk, seeking her thoughts. Julia remarked that she was enjoying the gathering, while Paul continued to evade. Nan excused himself to visit the bathroom located on the upper level. Unexpectedly, Nan, who had been trailing him, opened the bathroom door. Paul rejected Nan's advance, stating he was married. He quickly urged Julia to leave, without requiring their secret code phrase. During their journey home, Paul felt irritated with his wife for disregarding the word suspicious that he had repeated at the gathering. Meanwhile, Julia believed Paul was too uptight to appreciate the joy she was feeling. Paul also held the dislike for Daniel, who had approached Julia, while Julia found the interaction amusing. Julia eventually inquired about Nan, but Daniel dismissed her by saying the woman was bothersome for continually pressuring him. Once they arrived home, Daniel couldn't shake off the thoughts of the events they had just experienced. He wished to sleep and erase the party from his mind. However, Julia remained unfulfilled. She believed that she and Paul ought to explore their bedroom fantasies. Without hesitation, she voiced her thoughts and encouraged Paul to share his fantasies too. It turned out that Paul disagreed. He was even uncomfortable with Julia's sudden shift in demeanor, which was now charged with desire. Again, Julia voiced her feelings, expressing that she only wished to communicate her fantasies, dreams, and wishes with her husband. However, she wasn't sure why this urge had surfaced or why it required fulfillment. She simply felt their relationship was in need of transformation. The following day, Paul and Julia resumed work at the office. Mark approached Paul in his office, seeking clarification on why Paul had conducted a magazine interview without him. Mark felt let down that Paul hadn't invited him, but Paul replied calmly that Mark was on vacation with Vanessa, couldn't participate in the interview. Mark dismissed that excuse, claiming Paul could have rescheduled the meeting for after his return. However, Paul clarified that coordinating a suitable time wasn't straightforward, which left Mark feeling let down. He perceived that he wasn't really a peer but rather an outsider. Out of nowhere, Vanessa showed up, stating she was merely passing through and wanted to invite Paul for coffee. To cut to the chase, They conversed at the cafe till the copyright, and Vanessa proposed that she and Paul swap partners, intending to make a move on him. She revealed that she was acquainted with Julia and believed Paul was in need of some new experiences, explaining that Mark had also mentioned Paul's hesitation about being with Vanessa. Consequently, she sought ways to help Paul feel at ease with her. Nevertheless, Paul was actually taken aback by Vanessa's proposal. Noticing his reaction, Vanessa urged him to remain composed. She then attempted to convince Paul once more, emphasizing that she simply required his agreement, while Mark and Julia were enthusiastic about the idea. Paul continued to be hesitant and tried to decline, but Vanessa insisted he come over on Friday night for the four of them to practice. Once home, Paul talked about the situation, meeting with Julia, who accused her of urging Vanessa to convince him. Julia firmly maintained her desire for a shift in their relationship. Paul then pressed her to confess whether she had any real interest in Mark, but Julia clarified that she hadn't meant it that way, asserting that if she had truly wanted Mark from the beginning, infidelity would have been an option. On Friday night, Paul hesitantly made his way to Mark and Vanessa's apartment. After some light conversation, Vanessa took Julia upstairs, leaving Paul alone with Mark in the kitchen. Paul confessed to feeling anxious, but Mark reassured him to ease up since this was merely practice. At that moment, Paul inquired if Mark found his wife attractive, which caught Mark off guard and left him feeling insulted. He clarified that they were simply going to have dinner and chat, after which he could return home. Eventually, feeling uneasy, Paul resolved to proceed with the evening. Once Julia and Vanessa came back, they all shared dinner while engaging in conversation. Initially, they chatted casually about their jobs and shared experiences until they finished their meals. Suddenly, the music began, and Mark and Vanessa encouraged Julia and Paul to switch partners for a dance. Reluctantly, Paul and Julia complied with the evening's flow. Paul initially felt bewildered, as this was meant to be merely a rehearsal, yet it seemed far too personal. Nevertheless, by the end, he had lost his shyness around Vanessa. Night transitioned into morning, and the following day at home, Paul and Julia shared breakfast while reflecting on the previous evening. Julia hinted at her regret, which deeply distressed Paul, as he had acted with Julia in mind. However, Julia clarified that her feelings had simply gotten the best of her. That morning held a romantic ambience for Paul and Julia until Emma arrived and interrupted them, reminding them of her imminent birthday and her desire to stay over with friends that day. This time, Paul felt unconcerned about Emma's social activities and trusted her completely. Meanwhile, Julia remained delighted about their shared experience. She revealed to Vanessa that she felt invigorated, and the same applied to her feelings for Paul. That evening, Paul, Julia, Mark, and Vanessa dined on pizza after enjoying a theater show together. The gathering concluded back at Paul and Julia's home, where they once again swapped partners until they drifted off to sleep. The following morning, Emma and her friends returned home but found themselves unable to enter because her parents had locked the door. Paul, awakened, hurried to rouse Mark, Vanessa, and Julia to address the situation. They complete their tasks just in time before Emma and her friends see them. The group enjoys breakfast together with the bread Emma had brought, and later, Emma celebrates her birthday. In the kitchen, Julia inquires with Vanessa about the arrangements for their upcoming 10-year anniversary party. But Vanessa appears disinterested. She confides in Julia that Mark is being unfaithful, yet Julia thinks, aren't they accustomed to swapping partners? This situation was different. Mark was concealing something significant from her. Every time Vanessa tried to discuss it, Mark evaded her and labeled her as hysterical. Julia conveys this information to Paul, who reassures her not to be concerned about a similar occurrence in their relationship, as he believes their bond is now more open than it used to be. A few days prior to Vanessa's birthday celebration, Julia offers her assistance. They meet for lunch at a restaurant, and during the discussion, Vanessa continues to feel distressed and intends to insist that Mark be truthful with her about his infidelity. It was revealed that, unbeknownst to their partners, Mark's mistress was actually Julia herself. They had been involved in a clandestine affair. Julia felt they had breached their agreement, complicating their situation. particularly since she confessed to having fallen for Mark. She experienced jealousy each time she saw him with Vanessa. Ultimately, the two decided to end their affair because Mark still loved Vanessa. The following day, their secret was revealed, leading to a confrontation between Vanessa and Julia at home. Initially, Paul was skeptical, but his perspective shifted after he discovered the text messages on Mark's phone. Julia felt the sense of betrayal from both Mark and Paul. She attempted to have a conversation with Paul to resolve their issues, but he completely shut her out. With Paul unwilling to forgive her, Julia proposed that they spend the night apart. Conversely, Mark also made efforts to reconcile with Vanessa, yet she also rejected him and expelled him from her life. The friendships between Paul and Mark became increasingly strained following the event, prompting Mark to seek a new job. While he was packing, Paul entered the room and handed Mark the reward trophy. Mark did not experience guilt, even in the face of Paul accusing him of harboring jealousy all along and attempting to sabotage his relationship with Julia. Mark insisted that jealousy was not the issue, rather, Paul's obsession with his own ego had led him to overlook Julia. Nonetheless, Mark still regarded Paul as a friend. After their brief exchange, Paul's emotions softened, leading him to approach Vanessa, and Mark rekindled their romantic relationship. A few months later, they encountered each other by chance at the airport, where Vanessa was pregnant and nearing childbirth. At the same time, Paul and Julia were making plans for a trip to Paris to realize their long-held dream.